the information that Peter was talking about. I'd like to hear them talk to each other about that particular issue. Is the information that each of them was talking about the same, or was it different? And I'm happy to quit at that point. So we're going to been asking those, raising those other questions and seeing what sort of response we get in that regard.
Okay, thank you very much, Art. Okay, do you have your slides? Okay, I think that is a very good start. That perhaps Paolo starts.
Yes, well, I think we need to discuss it more to figure it out, but it's clear there were sort of similarities. But as I said, I think one difference was that in the quantum case, the Bohm-Hailey hypothesis is that there is an actual field that carries this information. But it's not like the electromagnetic field because it can also code information in many dimensions. But I think they weren't postulating it as a kind of purely platonic form that would come into the material system. And whereas in your case, I wasn't quite sure how you were thinking about it.
Okay, but would you agree that it's a bottom-up form of explanation? It's not a top-down type of information influence?
Well, actually, in some ways, of course, the top-down, that's a kind of metaphor which suggests that we have a big thing that's made of little thingies. So the little thingies are at the bottom, and the big thing is at the top. And the thing with quantum mechanics, of course, you see, if we go to quantum field theory, then actually the little thingies are not fundamental, but we have it's the fields that are fundamental. And so I think people who, philosophers who think about the new physics are not so keen with the metaphor of top-down, bottom-up as a kind of fundamental structure. But in the case of the Bohm theory, the Bohm theory is kind of conservative in the sense that it does postulate that there are little thingies, like, the electron is assumed to be a particle. A lot of the other interpretation of quantum mechanics don't do that. But in the Bohm theory, it's the field that guides the particle, and that can be seen as a top-down influence, if you like. So it's information that is actually guiding the thingies, and not the thingies that explain information.
Could Peter comment on that?
Yeah, so the only book of Bohm I ever read was called Bohm in Infinite Order. And my understanding was that the Hallet wave was introduced in order to try to save determinism. And I don't see any necessary connection between Bohm's notion of information linked with what may be happening in the brain. So in the brain, I think it's much closer to a Shannon-esque conception of information, where there have to be acts of decoding. And so a neuron functions as a decoder of its inputs. And I was arguing that it is decoding based upon informational criteria, like does it meet the criteria for a cat or a dog or a house, and that the only way to really understand what's going on is to understand it at this informational level. Because the selection criteria for what counts as satisfying inputs have to go to the level of what counts as a cat or a house. And so getting to John Dylan Haynes' point, or Peter Inwagen's point, that a particle-on-particle level description of causation should be sufficient to understand what's going on. I would say, no, in order to understand what's going on, you have to go to this informational level of analysis.
Thank you.
And that would be top-down in your view?
Yes. Tom, do you have any comment?
I have just a general question about some of the concepts used in this discussion. And I was very interested when people appealed to notions of formal causation. Because one very important feature of the tradition that Hobbes is attacking is its use of formal causation in the theory of action. And in the theory of content, more widely. It's the idea that the form of what you're thinking about is located in the faculty of your mind, but without informing you as it would inform something that would actually have the property you're thinking about. So you think of a square object, you're not square, but the form of squareness is in some ways inside your head. It gives form to the matter of the faculty that is involved in thinking about it. It's a very interesting theory, but one of the very interesting features of it is not a theory of self-determination. Indeed, it's not even obviously a theory of power in terms of a capacity to produce outcomes. It's a theory of constitution. And they precisely don't appeal to it to characterize freedom. They use it in the theory of rationality. And one huge question, which I think is floating through all these papers, is, are you in the business of providing a theory of rationality that's using information to provide a better theory of how we can respond rationally to the world, in a way that purely physical things don't? Or are you actually seriously trying to provide a theory of self-determination? Because if it's just rationality, that would include forming beliefs, or forming desires, which have contents, in a way that things with physical, but they happen to us. You know, the evidence forces the belief into my mind. Circumstances just make me form a desire. That's not freedom at all.
Is there a short comment? Otherwise, we'll let in the audience.
Yeah, perhaps just quickly in relation to the idea of catness or houseness or something like that being a informational thing. I think it is conceivable to build up those notions bottom up by visual processing and other types of things, and then generalization in the brain. And there are actually grandmother cells, so-called grandmother cells, that can be found as well, where you can find individual cells that actually respond only to the face of your grandmother and nothing else. So those things do exist in the brain as well as the sort of general conception. So it seems to me that it is possible to build up information of that type from a putting together of individual inputs to different regions. I mean, for example, there is a face region in the brain that one has, where there appears to be recognition of faces and things of that sort. We're putting together different sort of aspects of people's faces that can be recognized as such.
So the most extreme example of that I know of would be these so-called concept neurons that seem to fire if, say, Oprah Winfrey speaks, or if her name is written, or if you see a photograph. And it seems that the only thing that unites all of these very different types of input is Oprah Winfrey-ness. And then the question is, what are these criteria that count as linking all these very different sorts of inputs? And I would argue they have to be informational. I would argue that in order to understand what it means to hit a single in baseball, which includes infinitely many radically different physical outcomes, would be some sort of rule, like, person gets to first base. And the only way to understand that class of infinitely many events that count as getting onto first base would be an informational analysis. If you simply thought of what linked all these radically different physical states at the particle level, you would never get it. You have to go to this informational level.
Thank you. Let's let in the audience. Hans has been waving.
Okay. Just first to the grandmother neuron. It's nowadays coming up in a more attractive form of Jennifer Aniston neuron. But it is as stupid as it was when it is as stupid concept as it was with the grandmother neurons 20 or 30 years before. This is my comment to this point. So the other point, as neurophysiologist, I'm getting more and more confused. I've been becoming confused during the session, and now during the discussion I'm getting even more confused. What is the news about information? We are dealing with information all the time. We are aware of modulation of synaptic efficiencies, the different types of synaptic efficiencies. We know about causal effects that bigger systems are composed of smaller parts, composing this bigger system, and that the bigger systems are interfering, for example, via alteration of synaptic weights. For example, with the stress, I could give you a lot of examples from physiology about bottom-up and top-down causation, which is considered causation. And I'm asked what is new with the information concept that you have mentioned, with the synaptic resetting. At what point is it necessary to include quantum uncertainty to explain these things and so on? So to relate everything closer to what we know about physiology, for me.
Okay. Anyone wants to respond to that? Peter?
Well, I mean, I started on this enterprise confronting this exclusion argument, right? That if a physical description of whatever's at the lowest level, say particles, strings, whatever, quarks, is a sufficient account of physical causation, then there's no room at all for causal efficacy of anything at a higher level, whether governments or people or decisions or consciousness. It all is epiphenomenal. And certainly it doesn't seem that way. It seems that if some government says there shall be no Sharia law henceforth in Germany, that this requires an analysis at the level of whatever it is that Sharia law means. And to simply reduce it to particle-on-particle causation is not sufficient, because at the particle level, assuming indeterminism, there's infinitely many possible paths. But when you introduce this new law, like there shall be no Sharia law in Germany, this sculpts out a subset of what is physically possible, which is also consistent with that new law. And all these other physically possible paths that didn't meet those informational criteria won't happen. And so, in order to understand, I think, what's going on in the universe, you have to look at how these informational settings or criteria or parameters sculpt out among all the things that are physically possible at the particle level, that subset which is also informationally allowed.
Pablo?
Maybe I just perhaps clarify a bit that, as was also mentioned, that the Bohm theory, when he proposed it in 1952, it was a deterministic theory. So at some way, at the level of theory, it gets rid of quantum indeterminacy, but at the level of practice, it doesn't, because it's merely a hypothesis, and it is consistent with the uncertainty principle. But the point is still that, how would you say, what I showed very briefly is that you can think of physics with the Bohm theory as, if you like, we know classical physics, and then there is this extra term, the quantum potential, which is sometimes negligible, like in these macroscopic situations, but in other situations it's non-negligible, and it has a huge effect what the particle does. And now Bohm was happy to think of extensions of quantum theory, just like Penrose and many other people. So whatever can control the quantum potential can control, for example, the electron, or if you do the field theory, it can control the electromagnetic field. And therefore, if we speculate that mind would be in some kind of emergent hierarchy of fields, then mind could control matter through the quantum potential. And that's a very naive idea, but in that sense, it's kind of a determinism which you break by introducing these higher levels.
I understand. Is there more example than that was Penrose already tried to introduce nowadays?
Which one?
Quantum effects. Are there more examples than those that Penrose already tried?
Well, there are a few others that are trying to do that. Yeah.
Let's get back to that later. We will have ample time, but I think we have time for 2 short questions and short answers. Mike was first, and then Björn.
One question I think common to the 3 of you is how univocal you are in your concept of causation. Mark asked you about causation in general, presupposing that you settle on a relation. And yet I hear the tendency to dualism or beyond in your conception. So Peter, one interpretation of your enterprise, when you're looking for mental causation, is it's not the relata that are distinctively mental, but it's the relation itself, in which event it inclines you to reject what you call Newtonianism, because you think for it to be information-bearing, you need spatio-temporally contiguous mechanical processes, the force transfer sorts of theories. Whereas Kant wasn't into that game. When he was asking it, it was rather, in his local reductionist sense, univocally causal relations, but between distinct relata, for him was anathema because of the overdetermination multiplication problem. But that's about monism on causal relation, which is the way I would take your paper, which I excuse your discussion of it. Tom, I can't tell whether you're a dualist or not, because you just won't tell us enough about self-determination and this mysterious agency that Hobbes got wrong with his Humean sort of causation theory. And I do think in quantum theory, if there is such a thing as single chance raising singular causal relations of the probabilistic sort, it isn't what we normally think causation is. And so there would be a dualism as well, forced upon us by quantum theory.
Short answers, please.
In my case, I have been attempting to build a physicalist monist account that is not dualist.
I don't see why, I'm not actually necessarily saying that Hobbes was clearly wrong. But if you are an opponent of Hobbes, it's not obvious that you need to be a dualist. I just talked about a distinctive mode of determination of outcomes. That doesn't seem immediately to imply any particular doctrine about materiality or the immateriality of the bearer of the power. But obviously, were the power real, it would seem to involve a discontinuity in nature, since we have no tendency to postulate this strange sort of power outside human nature. That, of course, is why Hobbes, who was a materialist, hated it.
I think I also, my wish would be to have a monistic view, and you know, it's also possible to conceive situations where the Born rule breaks down, like, you know, the quantum indeterminacy need not be the sacred thing. But a lot of people like Valentini are showing possibilities about that, but basically the idea here is to extend the physics we have, not to postulate something non-physical, because then we are in the dualist troubles.
Okay, thank you. Did you mark what was it? Okay, then a short question and short answer from Björn.
I think in the interest of time, in the interest of in the interest of time, I'll just try to make it a short comment that doesn't require a specific answer, by the way. I think both. So the concept of using information as a tool to enhance our explanatory power is quite attractive, I think, for me subjectively, and I guess in what people call the information age is also quite a hip concept to do. Whereas I fear that probably in both the Bohmian and in Peter's case, I think the weak aspect of that may be empiricism. Because in the Bohmian case, you've mentioned it several times, and as physicists tell me, the Bohmian mechanics make pretty much the same predictions as classical quantum mechanics, which makes it exceedingly hard to test. So that's what I would consider a strong weakness, a heavy-hitting weakness. And in the case of Peter, I would say that...
Hey, suppose we've got Bohmian mechanics before the standard quantum mechanics. Would you use that argument against standard quantum mechanics?
Probably, it may well be. Right? And in Peter's case, I think also with regard to our current knowledge, it just has to remain an assertion. And that one that you make very forcefully. even though you tried to evade John's question quite a bit before he pressed you on it. But it will remain an assertion that, bottom-up causality is not sufficient. It may not be sufficient for us talking about it. It may just be much easier to talk about top-down causation as if there was some mystical informational effect that it has. That I grant you, but I think we still just don't know enough if this is really going to be something that will be required.
Thank you, Björn. I think we have to leave that comment uncommented. And let's thank the panel again.